I'm Lauren Carr, and welcome to the Mystery Review Crew podcast. For our first podcast, we're going to interview Kari Bovee, the award winning mystery author, and we're going to be talking about her Annie Oakley Mysteries, which have just come out in audiobook. When she's not on a horse or walking along the beautiful cotton laden landscape of Corrales, New Mexico, or basking on white sand beaches under the Big Island Hawaiian sun, Kari Bovee is escaping into the past, scheming murder and mayhem for her characters, both real and imagined, and helping them to find order in the chaos of her action packed novels. Kari Bovee writes the award-winning Annie Oakley Mystery Series, which is currently on tour with Ivory Book Tours, with an audiobook tour, because that series has just been released in audiobook. And she is also the author of the Grace Michelle Mystery Series, which will be touring in March. And she has many more ideas of many more plot lines and murder and mayhem mysteries that we will be discussing during our interview today. I thank you for joining us. And without any further ado, here is Kari Bovee.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Annie Oakley Mysteries? I'm sure everybody's heard of Annie Oakley.
Everybody's heard of Annie Oakley.
Everybody's heard of Annie Oakley. What inspired you to do the Annie Oakley Mysteries? What process, and tell us a little bit about her character as a mystery detective, as an amateur detective.
Sure.
A female protagonist, amateur detective.
That's right. What kind of prompted me was I hadn't even considered Annie Oakley, but my late father and I shared a love of history. And he suggested to me that I watch this Annie Oakley special. It was a PBS American, I think it's called a American Experience special on Annie Oakley. And he thought I would be really interested in her as a protagonist for a novel. And I watched it and I was amazed with her. I wasn't that interested in her before, but after I watched this, I really learned a lot about her and a lot about her history, which is very interesting, which a lot of people don't really, I don't know if they've really delved into her actual history, aside from the fact that she was, a sharpshooter in the Wild West show, kind of America's sweetheart kind of thing. And then the Broadway shows and the movie and the TV show. And they didn't really quite portray her with the depth of who she really was. And so after I saw that, I was like, well, what am I going to do with this? And I didn't want to write a biography. I didn't want to write nonfiction. I wanted to write mysteries. And I had read a series of books by Stephanie Barron, who's also known as Francine Matthews. And she used Jane Austen as an amateur sleuth. And I thought, what a good idea, And so I thought, well, maybe I could do Annie Oakley as an amateur sleuth. And that's kind of how it started.
Now, do you have Frank Butler in the
Absolutely,
in the books as well? Are they a romantic couple, or
they are? Yeah. And so in Shoot Like a Girl, which is the prequel novella, I didn't show the cover of that one. It sort of tells the story of her life before she joined the Wild West show, and it was a really particularly hard time for her. And that sort of sets the stage for the series. But in the first book of this series, Girl with a Gun, she does meet Frank Butler, and they're rivals in the Wild West show. And of course, out of that, Frank Butler was about 12 to 13 years older than Annie, but still they were very, very much attached. And she died fairly young. She died in her late 60s from pernicious anemia. So
what is that?
I'm not sure. It sounds like a blood disorder.
Sounds almost like leukemia.
Yeah. She was in a series of accidents. She was in a train accident that laid her up for a couple of years. And it was actually when she was with the Wild West show, and a lot of animals were killed, and it was a big deal. And then later on in life, she and Frank were in a car accident, and that set her back. But you know, she always made a comeback, and she performed almost up until the day she
So
died.
why don't you tell us about when, you know, because you took a real life person, somebody who really existed. So Annie's not, but you made her a fictional character. Uh, what was the process of doing that? I mean, how far do you feel like you could go as far as because, you know, like, do you feel like you need to reach out to the family to say, hey, I'm going to do this? Or you know, how far can you go in taking in fictionalizing a real person who is dead? You know,
Right.
how far do you feel that you can go with that? What was the process, your thought process in doing that?
Well, I was a little bit concerned about it, but I don't paint her in a negative light in any way.
Mm.
And I did sort of fudge some of the timeline of her life. For
Oh,
instance, in my books, she joins the Wild West show when she was 15. And that is in real life when she met Frank Butler, she was 15. But she actually didn't join the Wild West show until she was 26. And in the meantime, she and Frank kind of took their act, you know, sort of they did a vaudeville act, and there wasn't a lot of history about that period in time. So I just condensed it for my book. And I was interested in their relationship, and I was interested in her in the Wild West show. So I just kind of compressed it to add the two things together. But and then there are certain things like, you know, the horse. You know, I don't know if she had a special horse in her life. Um, and I just sort of embellished certain things that were fictionalized, but I really tried to stay true to what I had researched about Annie's character, about her person, um, about her personality. She was a very benevolent person. She was very uh, connected with her family. Her family was very important to her, and that's sort of the theme throughout the whole book. So she is trying to take care of her family, which she actually did as a young girl. She, you know, she learned to shoot a shotgun after her father passed away, and she would shoot game to help feed her family because they lived in poverty. And after her father died, they really struggled financially. And so she would shoot game to feed her family. And then she was so good at it that she shot so much game that she was selling it to the local mercantile and also the surrounding hotels. And they clamored for the meat that she shot because she had a good aim, and she would hit the birds in particular in the back of the head so that none of the shot was in the meat. So,
uh-huh.
you know,
Oh,
so she kind of had a reputation of doing that. So I just tried to stick with that. She was raised Quaker, so that comes into the stories a little bit, not a lot, but sort of her morality and her value system. I tried to stay true to.
mhm. Yeah, and I had heard that the way she and Frank met was, which was, I believe, was what was in Annie Get Your Gun, is that he came to town, you know, for a shooting match, and she entered, and he couldn't figure out why everybody was betting on her and not him, and that intrigued him. I got to meet this girl, you know,
Yeah,
because you know, and she actually did win.
she
Uh,
did. Yes. And
mhm.
you know that I always found that kind of interesting because, you know, most men in that day and age, first of all, you know, there weren't very many women sharpshooters. Second of all, she was just a teenager, and she beat him. And he, instead of getting, you know, his feathers ruffled and getting upset about it, he actually fell in love with her like almost instantly because he was just so amazed by her talent and the person that she was. So I thought that was really interesting.
You portray him in the book? Now, is he like her sidekick, or are they partners in the sleuthing?
Well, in in the first book, they're not so much partners, they're rivals. but there's this kind of underlying sexual tension between them and attraction between them. And so in the first book, he's really more the love interest, the rival, and that's how that develops. But in the later books, he is involved in the crime solving a little bit. I have introduced a great character who's fictional. Her name is Emma Wilson, and she is a suffragette reporter. And she's one of these characters, and I'm sure this has happened to you. She just walked onto the page, and she walked on the page in complete fabulousness. I mean, I just fell in love with her, you know, as she walked on the page. And so they're the two that really get into the meat of solving the
Tell
crimes.
us more about Emma, and how did she, you know, because that has happened to me where I've had, as a matter of fact, the book I just finished writing, I had a character just walk onto the page and they're fully developed. How did Emma come about to you? How was she birthed?
How was she birthed? Well, I knew that I wanted Annie to be an amateur sleuth. I knew I wanted her to be a crime solver. I also knew
at the time period, because that time period is about the time of the suffrages,
yes,
of women's liberation.
And I knew that Annie was also famous, and but she didn't have the skills or the connections to solve crimes. Like, she didn't have someone who could, for instance, in one of the books, I have the water tested to check for, you know, a toxin. Where would Annie Oakley be able to find someone like that? And she's performing all the time. So she's a very busy celebrity. And so one of the women that comes in to interview the group about a murder that's occurred is this Emma Wilson. And so I wanted to make it a female reporter. And she walks in, Annie's outside, and she comes running up to Annie, and she's dressed, you know, outrageously for the time, and she's like, "Yoo-hoo, Annie Oakley," you know. She comes over, and she's very intrigued with Annie because Annie's working in a man's world, and she is thriving and beating all the men, you know, in the shooting contests and things like that. And so she is very enamored of Annie for that reason and wants to get her involved in her suffragette causes. And when they first meet, you know, Emma's interest isn't really in the murder, it's in Annie, but then they kind of come together. So I needed someone who had those connections, you know. So she works at a newspaper, so she has a lot of connections with the police. She has connections with, you know, anyone that was, they didn't do DNA testing or anything like that, but they had some science. And so that's what I needed. And then while I was at it, I'm like, well, she's a female reporter. I kind of based her off of, you know, female reporters of the time, and Nellie Bly and people like that. And then I thought, why not make her a suffragette? And interestingly enough, Annie Oakley never joined the suffragette movement, but she was very supportive.
She doesn't strike me as a political sort, that she's just, I like shooting, you know.
She never tried to be like a man. She was very feminine. She dressed very feminine. She was very modest. But yet she was behind women in that she taught thousands of women to shoot. She felt that they all had a right to self-defense. And so she was a really interesting character. And the thing that I loved most about her was she was just empowered to be herself. And, you know, and that was kind of unusual for women then. She was just Annie. She was just herself. And so anyway, so I thought that the two of them, Annie and Emma, would make a great team, because Emma is sort of everything that Annie isn't. And so there's that, you know, kind of the opposites thing working, yet they're focused on the same things.
And so how did her personality come about? Because you know, you have what the character needed. to basically
Yes.
fill the void. So she's, and that's the thing with the amateur sleuths, whether it be historical, mystery, or when you have an amateur sleuth, you have to have a connection that gets you into the mystery.
Yes.
Like so many of the cozy mysteries, you have the boyfriend or the husband, or or the friend who works for the newspaper. And that, how did her personality, how do you keep Emma's personality from overpowering? Because she sounds like she's quite a character, just playing a character, that she doesn't overpower Annie.
Well, I had to be really careful about that because she is a very powerful character, and I've thought of doing a spin-off series with her, just because I just love her so much. But yeah, so I just really kept tried really hard to keep everything in Annie's point of view. I think in the third book, I have Annie, Emma, and Frank's point of view. I have 3 points of view in the third book. But I think Annie Oakley's pretty dynamic in herself. And so they make a great team together because they each have strengths that the other doesn't have, weaknesses that the other doesn't have. So it's kind of a nice partnership that was formed. And so that's kind of how I think I kept Emma from overpowering Annie.
At each of these events, or did you fictionalize them? Have you actually had to research her life so that you can, I can have a murder here, I can have a murder while she's over here, or is that how you did that?
Right, they're all based on real events. In the first book, it was when they were performing in St. Louis. And she had an Indian assistant. This didn't really happen, but the assistant who helped her with her costuming and was just a general helper to her was murdered. And so she sets out to solve that crime. And they did travel to England to perform for Queen Victoria's Jubilee. She did meet the Queen. She met the Prince and Prince Bertie and his wife, Alexandra. And so I have them in the second book. And I also added, because I'm such a British history buff, and I added, why can't I think of their names? Lily Langtry, who was a very famous socialite who was supposedly having an affair with Prince Bertie, and also the Irish poet Oscar Wilde. And they also helped to solve the crime. But Annie, I don't know if Annie really met them, but she did perform for the Queen. And they were in England for quite a long time. They did a few European tours. And then they were at the Chicago World's Fair. And there was a series of murders that happened at the Chicago World's Fair.
Oh, really? Did you find that out during your research or after?
Actually, kind of both. Actually beforehand, because I had known about the murders, and it was a serial murder situation. And so I thought that was really fascinating. So I kind of was like, oh, well, we need Annie involved in that.
Yeah, just let her. And did she solve the murder? The serial killer you brought in? No, you brought in the serial killer, or
well, it's a fictional serial killer. But she solves all the crimes on her own. She has a little bit of help, but she's the one that figures it out.
Now you have 2 other mystery series that are historical fiction and they're mystery. So why don't you tell us about those?
The other historical mystery series I have out is the Grace Michelle Mysteries. And this one takes place, the first book takes place on Broadway, 1920s, Ziegfeld Follies. The main character, Grace, is a up-and-coming costume designer for the Follies, and her sister's the big star of the show, and her sister's murdered. And so Grace has to step into her, Broadway shoes, her sister's shoes, and be a performer, which she doesn't want to do. She wants to be backstage. She wants to be, doing her art and costume design to solve the crime. And so that was really fun to write. The second book, she ends up in Hollywood working in the silent film industry, and a big famous director is murdered on a film that she's working on. And she and her husband have also opened up their Burbank ranch to wayward teens and abandoned teens or orphan teens. And I think there's 3 or 4 kids living on the ranch at the time, and one of the young girls is accused of this murder, and so she sets out to clear her name. And I've just finished up the third book, Grace Among Thieves, and this is when she becomes involved in kind of an international crime via her father, and so he gets into trouble with this crime, and so she sets out to figure out what's going on. And of course there's a murder that happens, and his wife is kidnapped, and so she's got to get into there and solve that. And that book will be coming out in February. And then I just finished a prequel to that series called Grace in the City, and it's before Grace and her sister find fame and fortune in the Ziegfeld Follies. And it's a time when they're living on the streets. They themselves have been orphaned, and they're living on the streets. And Grace gets into a scuffle and is accused of a crime that happens. And so she's got to clear her own name in that book. So, and then
now, what was your inspiration? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So the inspiration for that was I've always, like when I was little girl, I used to watch those black and white films all the time. And there was the Great Ziegfeld and the Ziegfeld Follies. And I was so mesmerized by the sets and the designs of the costumes. And so I was always kind of intrigued by that. And then in my adult years, I had a horse trainer who we happened to be having wine one evening, and we were talking, and she said, "Oh, did you know that my mother was a Ziegfeld girl?" And I was like, "What?" And so I kind of dove into that and just started researching the Ziegfeld Follies, trying to find this woman's name in any of the literature. I didn't find her name, but I came across some amazing stories, and he launched so many careers that, household names, that you would know. And so I thought, wow, this is going to be really fun. I want to have a costume designer who's a amateur sleuth. So that's how that got started.
Well, now what's Grace's background? What's her background? Because I read the books. It sounds almost like they were on the streets, which you're talking about the prequel where they're actually on the streets.
Yes. And her background is she does have a flair for sewing. And while she and her sister are on the streets, she makes doll clothes to sell. And that's how she kind of helps keep food on the table, or, helps them survive. And so she has an interest in that. And then when she gets into the Ziegfeld Follies, actually Florence Ziegfeld, and I go into this in the prequel, he finds them on the streets, and he sees immediately that Sophia, her sister, has the makings of a star. And that was one of the things he was really good at. He could spot someone, and he got, he knew exactly what they would be good at, and if they had star potential. So that's kind of what happens, and that's how they get involved. And then she works in the she works with the head costume designer, who was Lady Duff Gordon, who in real life, she did work in the Ziegfeld Follies. And so she works in the costume room as sort of a gopher, and just learns as much as she can. And that's how, and she just has a natural talent for it. And that's how she gets involved. And then in the Grace in Hollywood, she has just graduated from the Wolf School of Design in LA as a costume designer. So she is legit. She's a legit designer.
She's legit. Now, and what's the difference? Because you have two protagonists. You have Grace and you have Annie. Which do you prefer? Do you prefer using real people like Annie Oakley, or somebody who's totally fictional where you can play around with them a little bit?
Well,
what's the difference between the two?
That's exactly the difference. And it's much harder to use a real life historical figure because the research is much more tedious, And you really need to stay true to that person's character and what you've read about them and the history of them. When you're making a fictional character, when you're writing historical, you're always going to have to do research to make it sound believable and to bring it to life, sort of recreate that world. But it's
no,
much
well, like
easier.
with Annie, it's so far long ago. I don't imagine that there would be much film where you can actually see, like today, like if you were going to do a mystery based on use Ronald Reagan as a detective. There's so much out there that you can get a sense of what he's about. But somebody like Annie Oakley, you don't have that volume of
No. And so that's what made it really hard. And I actually got really tired after writing the Annie Oakley books. It was exhausting. And so to move on to a fictional character, and I do have a lot of real life people in the Grace Michelle books. Florence Ziegfeld Jr., of course, Fanny Bryce is in it. I have, W.C. Fields makes an appearance. So I had a lot of fun with that because I love it when I read historical fiction and a real life person pops in. It's just like they have a cameo or something. I just think that that's so fun. And so I do have that. I am getting ready to write a new series next year. I'm going to be starting, and it's the Arabella Price Mysteries. And she is completely fictional. I'm basing the town that she ends up in on a Colorado mining town, the town of Durango, Colorado, but it's going to be a fictional town. And she's a really interesting character. She's an actress. So I don't know if you've noticed, but all of my series have a show business angle.
Yes, I noticed that.
Yeah.
And do you have that background?
No, but I've always been fascinated with it. I did do some theater work, but in college, I directed a one-act play. And then after college, I worked at a community theater as a stage manager. And, so I've always really loved all of that and just really been intrigued and interested in it. And so all of my protagonists have, an interest, or they wind up in show business in some way. And so in this new series, she's a very well-known actress in New York who comes to this very small mining town. She's inherited this hotel, and she goes to the hotel to get it ready for sale. And all these things happen that keep her in that little town. And so throughout the series, she's trying to get out of that town. But but she's very interested.
And what time period does this happen?
1890s.
Okay.
So similar to the Annie Oakley time period. The Annie Oakley books take place between 1885 and 1893. And this takes place in the late 1890s. So and then I have a standalone book called Bones of the Redeemed, and that's a Southwestern mystery.
That took place like in the 1950s. Am I
correct?
I read that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't seem to have a favorite. Well, you seem to have like around the turn of the century, century. You have
that's my favorite time.
Period.
Yeah.
Yeah. But why did you set Bones of the Redeemed in the 1950s?
Well, because I actually started, when I first started writing it, it was contemporary. And then I wrote it, and then I put it down for years. I mean, this is one of my first books that I started writing, and put it down for years, and then brought it back to life, had it edited. Because I started writing it so early in my career that my writing had changed, and so I wanted it to be historical, but I couldn't go too far back in time. But I couldn't make it contemporary because I think I started writing it in like the 90s, and 1990s, and then by the time I got back to it, everything was, so I just thought, I'm going to make it in the 1950s, which in the Southwest was a really interesting time because of the war and all of the nuclear stuff that went on and things like that. So that's kind of why I said it in the 50s.
Why do you gravitate? Because the 3 series that you have, why do you gravitate towards the 1890s, 1900s? What
Because
is it about that attracts you?
there was a lot going on. I mean, we had the invention of electricity. We had, all kinds of innovations in science, and then especially for women, women's lives were changing, and they were becoming, more involved in the workforce. And in the 1920s, we just came off of World War I, and women had a completely, different role after that. And then, the 20s, it was like the war was over and life was great, and it was a very prosperous time. And so I just think that those two time periods were very interesting for women in particular. Because, you had, like I mentioned, Nellie Bly was breaking into, journalism and investigative journalism, and Annie Oakley, of course. And then there were other women performers who weren't seen as, prior to that, women performers were often seen as, scandalous and things like that. And so I think things were just really changing, and that's why I think was interesting in those time periods.
But do you find that because the time period is set back then, before women were liberated and before women were independent, that you have to have some characters who are dismissive of them and not helping them? And do you have to put that in there, or do you have to fudge a little bit and have more people take them seriously?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question before. There are people, for instance, Annie's mother is a little bit scandalized that she's going to be joining this troop of, cowboys and Indians and traveling on the road, and, a good Quaker girl doesn't behave that way, and I have certain things, come up, and I paint some of the characters. In the Grace series, some of the women kind of get snubbed for what they do. And but I think I also have a blog. It's called Empowered Women in History. And there were some amazing women in those time periods who did amazing things that just weren't spoken about as much, and so I think that it was there. It just wasn't necessarily covered or appreciated, but there were some incredible women who did incredible things.
But I notice in your books that you don't preach on that you're just, like, you're not making a political statement in your books.
No.
You're just, this is the story. This is something to have fun with.
Yes.
That this is, this is the character. This is basically, for lack of a better term, this is what it is.
Right. I mean, my goal and I feel my purpose is to entertain and to possibly illuminate and maybe educate or inspire people. But I don't really want to come out and be political in any way, or we get enough of that.
Yeah, I know.
We get enough of that.
And I found that there have been some historical mysteries or series that on TV that are historical fiction mystery. And I find I have to turn it off because, okay, I don't want to hear any more about that.
Yeah, I know. It kind of creeps into a lot of things. And I read to escape. Same with you. I watch certain shows to escape, and I write to escape. And that's what I want to provide for my readers. I want them to go back into a time period when it might not have been simpler, but it was just different and not as fast paced, and so.
Yeah, like I noticed in your mysteries, you don't have the cell phones.
Oh, no. And you know what? I found that, I did attempt a contemporary mystery, and I found that I had to be so technologically savvy to write these, and know about a lot of the science and the, the technology that people use. And I just didn't want to go there. I wanted to go back to a time when it was more, you had to have evidence, of course, but there was a lot of gut intuition, and, you followed, leads physically, not on a computer, those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it would be intimidating to write contemporary for those reasons, because you got to get it right, and technology is always changing.
Yeah, yeah. I like my first book came out in like 2001, and and I tried never to go back. And I think the last time that I read through it for something was, I had email technology that isn't there today, or rather that it's changed. That
Yes.
a lot, and I had Joshua Thornton explaining stuff to them that nowadays would be just like, well, it, because stuff, you have to keep up on that.
No flip phones. No more flip
No
phones.
No more flip phones. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And I have books that are written where people are using flip phones, because so now they're outdated. Books that I wrote 15 years ago are now outdated.
But I think people
Just because
understand that. I think people understand that when they read a book. I was just, what was I watching? I was watching or reading something, and they had kind of outdated technology, but I just took it for what it was, and when it was
Mhm.
made. And so I think people understand that. But I think to write it, I think is, props to you, because I think that's really hard.
Thank you so much for stopping by at the Mystery Review Crew podcast for our interview with Kari Bovee. If you enjoyed the interview, then do be sure to give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to receive notifications for our upcoming podcast.